The fluorescent lights of Studio 7 cast their familiar harsh glow across the polished set, as Steve Harvey adjusted his signature bow tie for what felt like the 1,000th time that morning. The burgundy fabric felt tighter than usual around his collar, or maybe it was just the weight of everything pressing down on his chest that made breathing feel like work today. He'd been hosting shows for over 2 decades, but this Tuesday morning in Los Angeles felt different somehow, heavier with an expectation he couldn't quite name. His production assistant, Monica, approached with her usual clipboard and nervous energy. "Steve, we've got about 15 minutes before we're live. Kim's team just confirmed she's in her dressing room and ready to go. You good?" Her question hung in the air longer than it should have, and Steve realized he'd been staring at his reflection in the black screen of the teleprompter without really seeing it. Yeah, I'm good," he replied automatically, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. But Monica's concerned expression told him his usual charm hadn't quite reached his eyes this time. She'd been with the show for 3 years, now long enough to recognize when his smile was working overtime to cover something else. The green room buzzed with its typical pre-show energy as hair and makeup artists made final touches, producers reviewed talking points, and the catering team refreshed the coffee that nobody would drink, but everyone needed nearby. Steve found himself thinking about his mother, Eloise, who at 89 still insisted on watching every episode from her assisted living facility in Cleveland. Yesterday's phone call played on repeat in his mind, her voice weaker than he'd ever heard it, struggling to remember his middle name, asking when he was coming to visit for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, preparing to interview one of the most famous women in the world about success and perseverance, while his own foundation felt like it was shifting beneath his feet. He'd built a career on being the guy who had answers, who could make people laugh when they needed it most, who dispensed wisdom with the confidence of someone who'd figured it all out. But lately, the questions people asked him seemed to echo in empty spaces inside his chest. Kim Kardashian's arrival shifted the energy in the studio like a small earthquake. Even seasoned television professionals found themselves straightening their posture and checking their appearance when she walked through a room. Steve had interviewed countless celebrities over the years, A-list actors, chart-topping musicians, best-selling authors. But there was something about Kim that commanded attention in a way that transcended traditional fame. She moved through the hallway toward the set with purpose, her team trailing behind like a well-choreographed dance. But what struck Steve as unusual was the way she made eye contact with everyone she passed. Not the vacant, polite acknowledgement that most celebrities offered, but genuine recognition. She thanked the sound engineer by name, complimented the set designer on the new backdrop, and asked Monica about her daughter's college applications. "Mr. Harvey," Kim extended her hand as she approached, and Steve noticed something in her demeanor that seemed different from her usual media appearances. There was a groundedness to her presence, a quality that suggested she was fully present in this moment, rather than mentally rehearsing talking points or calculating public perception. "Thank you for having me on the show. I've been looking forward to this conversation." The sincerity in her voice caught him slightly off guard. Most guests approached these interviews as necessary promotional stops, checking boxes on their publicity tour schedules. But Kim's tone suggested she viewed this as something more meaningful, an actual exchange rather than a performance. As they walked onto the set together, Steve fell into his familiar pre-show rhythm, testing the microphone levels, reviewing the note cards he never really needed, acknowledging the live studio audience with his trademark grin and wave. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, their energy filling the space with warmth and expectation. But underneath his professional composure, that strange heaviness remained, like a low-frequency hum that only he could hear. The countdown from the control room began, and Steve felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with live television. 3, 2, 1, the red light blazed to life, and suddenly they were broadcasting to millions of homes across America. "Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Steve Harvey Show." His voice boomed with practiced enthusiasm as the audience erupted in applause. "We've got a special guest with us today. Businesswoman, mother, reality TV icon, and someone who's basically redefined what it means to build an empire in the 21st century. Please welcome Kim Kardashian." Kim settled into the guest chair with elegant composure, but Steve noticed something in her eyes that seemed more attentive than usual, as if she was studying him as much as he was preparing to interview her. The studio lights created a warm glow between them, and the audience's energy provided the perfect backdrop for what should have been a straightforward celebrity interview. "Kim, thank you for being here," Steve began, settling into his familiar interview cadence. "You've got so much going on. The business empire, the family, the legal studies. How do you keep it all together?" It was the kind of question he could ask in his sleep, the perfect opener that would let her talk about her latest projects, while establishing her credibility and relatability. But instead of launching into her usual talking points about time management and prioritization, Kim tilted her head slightly and studied his face for a moment that lasted just a beat too long. "You know, Steve, before I answer that, can I ask you something? How do you keep it all together? Because from where I'm sitting, you're the one who seems to have mastered the art of balance." The question hung in the air like a curveball Steve hadn't seen coming. In 20 years of hosting, he'd perfected the art of deflecting attention back to his guests, of making himself the facilitator rather than the focus. But something in Kim's tone suggested this wasn't just polite conversation or attempt to flatter the host. "Well, you know," Steve began with a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes, "I just take it one day at a time, try to stay grateful for the opportunities I've been given." His response was automatic, the kind of humble deflection that had served him well throughout his career. But Kim wasn't buying it. She leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from celebrity interview pleasant to genuinely curious. "That's what you tell everyone, though, isn't it? I mean, you're always the one taking care of everybody else, making sure everyone feels comfortable, has what they need. But who takes care of Steve Harvey?" The question hit him like a physical blow, so unexpected and direct that he felt his carefully constructed professional persona waver for just a moment. The studio audience was still smiling, waiting for his trademark witty comeback, but Steve found himself genuinely speechless for the first time in years. Well, he started, then stopped, realizing that his usual arsenal of deflective humor felt inadequate in the face of Kim's straightforward sincerity. There was something about the way she was looking at him, not with the expectation of entertainment or wisdom, but with genuine concern, that made his throat feel tight. Kim seemed to sense his discomfort and gracefully shifted the conversation back to safer territory, but the moment lingered in the air between them like a door that had been cracked open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. As they moved through the standard interview topics, her latest business ventures, her children, her philanthropic work, Steve found himself studying his guest with new interest. There was depth to Kim Kardashian that the tabloids and social media snapshots never captured. She spoke about her legal studies with genuine passion, describing how working on criminal justice reform had changed her perspective on everything from privilege to purpose. When she talked about her children, her voice softened in a way that revealed layers beneath the public persona. "You know what I've learned through all of this," Kim said, referring to her work helping to free wrongfully convicted individuals. "Everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, not just the role they play or the image they project. Sometimes the people who seem strongest, who everybody looks to for answers, are carrying the heaviest loads." Steve felt something twist in his chest as her words seemed to speak directly to experiences he'd never voiced publicly. Throughout his career, he'd been the guy people turned to when they needed encouragement, advice, or just someone to make them laugh when life felt overwhelming. But Kim's observation touched on something he'd been struggling with privately, the exhaustion that came with always being on, always being the source of strength for others. As they broke for commercial, the familiar bustle of a live television, production swirled around them. Makeup artists rushed over for touch-ups, producers whispered last-minute notes, and the audience settled back into their seats with the practiced patience of people who understood the rhythm of television tapings. But in the quiet bubble that surrounded Steve and Kim's chairs, something had shifted. Kim turned to him with the cameras still rolling, but the microphones temporarily muted, and her expression was softer than anything the viewing audience would see. "Steve," she said quietly, leaning closer so only he could hear. "Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" The question was so simple, so direct, and delivered with such genuine concern that Steve felt something inside him crack just slightly. He'd been asked variations of this question countless times, by his wife, his manager, his kids, but usually in the context of his health, his career, his public image. Kim's question felt different somehow, like she was asking about the part of him that existed underneath all the roles and responsibilities. He started, then stopped, realizing that his automatic response felt false in the face of her sincere inquiry. "Why do you ask?" Kim glanced around to make sure they still had privacy, then looked back at him with an expression that was both knowing and kind. "Because I recognize the look. I've worn it myself plenty of times. The smile that does all the heavy lifting while everything underneath feels complicated." Before Steve could respond, Monica was signaling from the side of the stage that they were coming back from commercial in 30 seconds. The moment of quiet honesty evaporated as quickly as it had formed, replaced by the familiar energy of live television. But something had been planted in that brief exchange, a seed of recognition that would continue growing throughout the rest of their conversation. As the cameras rolled again and Steve launched into his next set of questions, he found himself thinking about Kim's words, "the smile that does all the heavy lifting." He'd never heard it described quite that way, but the phrase resonated with something deep in his experience that he'd never been able to articulate. The energy in the studio shifted palpably as they returned from the commercial break. Kim settled back into her chair with a different kind of presence, and Steve could sense that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them. What had started as a typical celebrity interview was transforming into something neither of them had planned, but both seemed willing to explore. "Welcome back to the Steve Harvey Show," Steve announced to the cameras, his voice carrying its usual warmth but with an undercurrent of uncertainty that careful listeners might detect. "We're here with Kim Kardashian, and before the break, we're talking about balance and success. But Kim, I have a feeling you want to take this conversation in a different direction." Kim nodded, her expression thoughtful and purposeful. "You know, Steve, I came here today to talk about my latest business ventures, my skincare line. Maybe share some funny stories about the kids. But sitting here with you, I realize there's something more important we should be discussing." She turned to face the audience, her voice taking on a tone of genuine advocacy. "How often do we check on the people who are always checking on everyone else?" The question rippled through the studio audience like a stone dropped in still water. Several people nodded knowingly, and Steve felt the familiar sensation of being seen in a way that made him simultaneously grateful and uncomfortable. Kim continued, her words gaining momentum and clarity. "We live in a culture where we expect certain people to be strong all the time. The entertainers, the leaders, the people who make us laugh or inspire us or help us through our own tough times. But what happens to them when they need support? Who do they turn to when the weight of everyone else's expectations becomes too much to carry?" Steve found himself nodding along, feeling both exposed and validated by her words. Throughout his career, he'd been the guy people called when they needed a pep talk, a laugh, or perspective on their problems. His phone was constantly buzzing with friends, family members, and colleagues seeking his advice, or simply his reassuring presence. But Kim's observation touched on something he'd been grappling with privately, the loneliness that could exist, even in the middle of a crowd of people who cared about him. That's actually something I've been thinking about lately," Steve admitted, his usual interview persona beginning to crack around the edges. "You spend so much time being what everyone needs you to be that sometimes you forget what you need for yourself." Kim leaned forward, her expression becoming more intimate despite the cameras and the live audience. "Exactly. And the crazy thing is, people assume that success equals happiness, that fame equals fulfillment. But the truth is, sometimes the higher you climb, the more isolated you can feel. Success doesn't automatically solve the human need for genuine connection and understanding." The studio had grown unusually quiet, with even the production crew seeming to sense that something significant was unfolding. Steve felt a familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the kind that came when emotions he'd been carefully managing threatened to surface at inconvenient moments. "Kim," he said, his voice softer than his usual television projection, "can I ask you something? How do you deal with that? The isolation, I mean. Because you're right, people look at what we have, the opportunities, the platforms, and they assume we've got it all figured out." "Honestly?" Kim's response was immediate and raw. "Some days I don't deal with it well at all. There are mornings when I wake up feeling like I'm performing my own life, like everyone expects me to be this version of myself that's always confident, always put together, always grateful. And don't get me wrong, I am grateful. But gratitude doesn't erase the very human need to be seen and understood for who you are underneath all the public expectations." Steve felt something deep in his chest recognize the truth in her words. The constant performance of gratitude, the pressure to always be on, the weight of other people's projections and expectations, it was like she was describing his own internal experience with a clarity he'd never been able to achieve. "Don't you know what the hardest part is?" Steve found himself saying, the words emerging before his professional filter could stop them. "It's not the criticism, or the pressure, or even the loneliness. It's the guilt you feel for even acknowledging that any of this is difficult when you know how blessed you are." Kim nodded emphatically, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Yes, that's exactly it. People will say, 'What do you have to complain about?' Or, 'Your problems aren't real problems.' But mental health doesn't discriminate based on bank account, balances, or public recognition. Pain is pain, regardless of the package it comes wrapped in." The conversation had taken on a momentum of its own, flowing far beyond the boundaries of typical daytime television. Steve could see Monica in his peripheral vision, probably wondering whether she should step in and redirect the discussion back to safer promotional territory. But something about this exchange felt too important to interrupt, too honest to derail for the sake of conventional programming. "I think about this a lot, especially in relation to my community," Steve continued, feeling like he was stepping into uncharted territory. "As a black man in entertainment, there's this additional layer of expectation to be strong, to be a role model, to never show weakness or vulnerability. The pressure to represent well, to never give people ammunition, to say you don't deserve what you've achieved." Kim's expression grew even more serious, and she nodded with the gravity of someone who understood systemic pressures, even from her different vantage point. "That's such an important point, Steve. The way society puts different communities under different microscopes, expects different levels of perfection or resilience. It's not fair and it's not sustainable. And then you add being a father, a husband, a son who's watching his mother's health decline." Steve's voice caught slightly on the last words, and he felt the careful composure he'd maintained for decades beginning to slip. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in everyone else's needs while pretending I'm the lifeguard." The metaphor hung in the air between them, and Steve realized he'd just articulated something he'd never said out loud before, not even to his wife or his closest friends. The studio audience was completely silent now, leaning forward as if they sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply human. Kim reached across the space between their chairs and gently touched his arm, a gesture so simple and genuine that it bypassed all of Steve's professional defenses. "Steve," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt both maternal and sisterly, "what you just described, that's not weakness, that's being human. And the fact that you've carried all of that while still showing up for everyone else, while still bringing joy and wisdom to millions of people, that's not just strength, that's extraordinary." Something inside Steve's chest cracked open at her words. Throughout his life, praise had usually been tied to his performance, his ability to entertain or inspire or provide for others. But Kim's acknowledgement felt different. She was seeing and validating the struggle itself, not just his ability to overcome it or hide it. "But here's what I want to say to you," Kim continued, her voice growing stronger and more passionate. "And to everyone watching who might be in a similar place. Your worth isn't determined by how much you can give to other people. Your value as a human being isn't tied to your ability to be strong for everyone else all the time." Steve felt tears beginning to gather in his eyes, and for the first time in his television career, he didn't immediately fight them back. Kim's words were penetrating defenses he'd spent years constructing, reaching places in his heart that he'd convinced himself were better left alone. "You know what changed everything for me?" Kim asked, her tone becoming more personal and reflective. "It was realizing that the people who truly love us don't just love us for what we can do for them. They love us for who we are, including the parts that are struggling, the parts that need support, the parts that don't have all the answers." The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over, rolling down Steve's cheeks as 20 years of carefully managed emotions began to surface. He'd cried before, at his mother's bedside, in private moments with his family, during overwhelming moments of gratitude, but never on live television, never in front of millions of viewers who knew him as the man who always had it together. "Sorry," he whispered, reaching for the tissues that Monica had quietly placed within reach. "I don't usually. This isn't what people tune in to see." But Kim shook her head firmly, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, Steve. This is exactly what people need to see. They need to see that it's okay to not be okay sometimes. They need to see that even the strongest people need support, need permission to be human, need to know that their worth isn't conditional on their ability to carry everyone else's burdens." The dam that Steve had built around his emotions over decades of public life finally burst completely. What had started as a few tears rolling down his cheeks became something much deeper and more profound. His shoulders shook as years have accumulated. Pressure, grief, fear, and exhaustion poured out of him in front of millions of viewers. The composed television host who always had the right words, the perfect comeback, the reassuring presence for everyone else, dissolved into a man experiencing raw, unfiltered human emotion. Kim didn't try to stop him or redirect the moment. Instead, she sat quietly, her own tears flowing freely now, creating a space of safety and acceptance around his vulnerability. The studio audience remained completely silent, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something sacred, a moment of complete authenticity in a medium that usually trafficked in careful performance and managed spontaneity. "I'm sorry," Steve managed between sobs, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know why." But even as he apologized, part of him recognized that this breakdown had been building for months, maybe years. Every phone call with his mother, where she seemed a little more confused, every moment when he'd smiled through his own pain to help someone else with theirs, every night when he'd lain awake, wondering if he was failing the people who counted on him. It all came rushing out in this unexpected moment of grace. Kim leaned closer, her voice gentle but clear enough for the microphones to pick up. "Steve, you don't need to apologize for being human. You don't need to apologize for having feelings or needs or moments when the weight becomes too much. What you need to know is that showing this vulnerability doesn't make you weak. It makes you real." Her words seemed to give him permission to stop fighting the emotions, to let them exist without immediately trying to manage or contain them. For the first time in years, Steve allowed himself to simply feel without simultaneously calculating how those feelings might affect others, or what they might reveal about his capacity to handle his responsibilities. "You know what I see when I look at you," Kim continued, her voice carrying a strength and clarity that cut through his emotional storm. "I see a man who has spent his entire career lifting other people up. I see someone who has used his platform to encourage, to inspire, to make people laugh when they needed it most. I see a father who has loved his children fiercely, a husband who has worked to build something beautiful with his wife, a son who has honored his parents, even when it's been difficult." Steve looked up at her through his tears, and something in Kim's expression reminded him of his mother during his childhood. That combination of fierce love and unwavering acceptance that could see through all pretense to the heart of who someone really was. "But more than any of that," Kim said, her voice growing stronger and more passionate, "I see a man who matters not because of what he does for other people, but because of who he is. Your worth isn't tied to your ability to be strong for everyone else. Your value doesn't diminish when you need support. You matter, Steve Harvey, not because you're a successful television host or because you make people laugh, or because you give great advice. You matter because you're a human being who deserves love and care and understanding, especially when you're struggling." The words hit Steve like a revelation he'd been waiting his entire life to hear. Throughout his career, his sense of value had been inextricably linked to his performance, his ability to provide for others, his capacity to be what people needed him to be. But Kim's declaration stripped away all of those conditional measures of worth and offered something he'd never fully believed he deserved: unconditional acceptance of his humanity. The studio audience began to stir, but not with discomfort or impatience. Instead, a wave of supportive energy began to build in the room. Someone in the back began clapping slowly, and the applause spread throughout the studio, not the enthusiastic, entertainment-focused clapping that usually filled television tapings, but something deeper and more respectful. It was applause for courage, for vulnerability, for the kind of authentic moment that reminded everyone present of their shared humanity. Steve wiped his eyes and looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected understanding rather than judgment, compassion rather than pity. In the control room, he could see his production team wiping their own eyes, and he realized that this moment was affecting everyone who witnessed it. "I think," Steve said, his voice still shaky but growing, stronger, "I think I've been so afraid of letting people down that I forgot it was okay to be let down sometimes myself. I've been so focused on being the answer for everyone else that I stopped asking my own questions." Kim nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly it. And Steve, can I tell you something that might sound crazy? Some of the most powerful moments in my own life have come from the people I looked up to showing me their vulnerability. When someone I respected let me see their struggles, their fears, their humanity. Those were the moments when I felt most connected to them, most inspired by them." The conversation was creating ripples throughout the studio, and unbeknownst to them, across social media and in living rooms around the country. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a moment of collective recognition about the masks everyone wears, the burdens everyone carries, and the courage it takes to be authentic in a world that often rewards performance over truth. "You know what's beautiful about this moment?" Kim asked, addressing both Steve and the broader audience. "Everyone watching this is probably thinking about someone in their own life who seems to have it all together, who's always strong for everyone else, who never seems to need support. And maybe this is giving them permission to check on that person, to ask the hard questions, to create space for them to be human too." Steve felt something shifting inside him, a recognition that this breakdown might actually be a breakthrough. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt the pressure to be perpetually strong, eternally grateful, consistently available for others while neglecting their own needs. The shame he'd expected to feel about crying on television was being replaced by something unexpected: relief. "I need to call my mother after this," Steve said, managing a smile through his tears. "Not to check on her, but to let her check on me. To tell her that her son is struggling sometimes and that's okay. To ask for her prayers not just for my success but for my peace." Kim's face lit up with joy at his words. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The people who love us want to care for us, not just be cared for by us. When we let them see our full humanity, we're actually giving them a gift, the opportunity to love us completely, including the parts that aren't perfect or strong or put together." As the interview began to wind toward its conclusion, both Steve and Kim seemed to recognize that they had created something special together, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the usual boundaries of celebrity culture and entertainment television. The conversation had evolved into something that felt more like a healing session than a promotional interview. "Kim," Steve said, his voice still thick with emotion but steadier now, "I don't know what I expected when you walked into this studio today, but this—" He gestured between them, encompassing the tears, the honesty, the vulnerable exchange they'd shared. "This is the most real conversation I've had on television in 20 years. "Same here," Kim replied, her own voice emotional. "And you know what I hope people take from this? I hope they understand that checking on each other isn't just about asking if someone's okay. It's about creating space for them to not be okay sometimes. It's about loving people through their struggles, not just celebrating their successes." As the show moved toward its final segment, Steve felt fundamentally changed by the experience. The tears had stopped, but something deeper had shifted. For years, he'd carried the weight of everyone else's expectations along with his own, believing that his worth was tied to his ability to be consistently strong, perpetually wise, endlessly available. But Kim's words and her willingness to see him as fully human had cracked open a new possibility, the chance to be loved and valued, not despite his struggles, but including them. The final applause from the studio audience felt different from any he'd received before. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment or admiration for success. It was recognition of shared humanity, acknowledgement of courage and gratitude for a moment of truth in a world that often felt saturated with performance and pretense. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, Steve sat quietly, for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. Kim remained beside him, both of them seeming to understand that they had participated in something that would resonate far beyond this single television taping. The crew began their usual post-show routine, but everyone moved more quietly than usual, as if preserving the sacred quality of what they had just witnessed. Monica approached cautiously, her eyes red-rimmed but smiling. "Steve, I've never seen anything like that. The phones are already ringing off the hook, but not with complaints or criticism. People are calling to say thank you, in tea." The days that followed, Steve would discover that Kim had been right about the impact of their conversation. Social media exploded with messages from people sharing their own struggles, with the pressure to be perpetually strong, with stories of checking on the people in their lives who seemed to have everything figured out, with gratitude for seeing two successful people model what authentic vulnerability could look like. But in that immediate moment, as the studio emptied and Steve prepared to leave, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the peace that comes from being fully seen and completely accepted. Kim had given him a gift he didn't even know he needed: permission to be human, to struggle, to need support, and to believe that his worth wasn't conditional on his ability to carry everyone else's burdens. Walking out of Studio 7 that evening, Steve pulled out his phone and dialed his mother's number. When Eloise answered, her voice weak but warm, he found himself saying something he'd never said before. "Mama, I need you to pray for me. Not for my success or my health or my career. I need you to pray for my heart, because your son is learning how to be human again, and it's scary and beautiful, and I could use some of that mother's love that doesn't depend on me having all the answers." The conversation that followed was different from any they'd shared in years. Not him checking on her, but two people who loved each other creating space for complete honesty. And as Steve drove home through the Los Angeles evening, he realized that Kim Kardashian had given him something more valuable than any career advice or business opportunity. She had reminded him that he was worthy of love, not because of what he could do for others, but simply because he existed, struggled, hoped, and dared to be authentically human in a world that often demanded performance instead of truth.